So like I go into it being like, oh, I'm Asian, I'm a Chinese person. And then as time goes on, you start to realize that Americans really don't see that. They just see like a black person.
Welcome to a special season of Misfits, a podcast for people who may not always fit in, but who choose to stand out in their communities. I'm your host, Annie Prafke. As National Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month 2023 comes to a close, we are releasing a series of episodes that feature conversations with Asian Americans. We talk about race and identity, but we also address other topics in our community, including religion, family, careers, and our creative pursuits. Today, we hear from Ronald Yiman, who also goes by Don Ronaldo, honoring his Spanish roots, and his nephew, Christopher, or Chris Yiman. Ronald is a Catholic priest from Trinidad who is of Chinese and Trinidadian Creole descent, which includes African, Indigenous, and Spanish ancestry. Ronald also self-published a book in 2020 about his family history called Tropical Symphony, a story of a unique Trinidadian Chinese family. Now retired, he lives in Fargo, North Dakota. Chris is a software engineer based in Seattle, Washington. In this conversation, which was recorded on May 15, 2020, we discuss anti-Black attitudes and colorism in the U.S., as well as in Asian and Caribbean communities in other parts of the world. We also talk about family history and religion across generations. Please note that this interview was lightly edited for clarity and time.
My name is Christopher Yiman. I was born in Trinidad and Tobago in '85. Born and raised there. I grew up there and came to the U.S. at age 19. That was in 2004 for school. Lived in New York for about 9 years. And now I live in Seattle, Washington. Of mixed race descent, half of African descent, half of Chinese descent.
Yes, Ron E. Mon is my name, a retired multi-local from Fargo, North Dakota, originally born in Trinidad. I'm a former teacher, pastor, and current writer-poet. I enjoy retirement from a life free of schedules and appointments. So Fargo is quite suited for me in my present eremitical lifestyle, which is
Wonderful.
Concentrated on prayer, study, and writing. So here I am, uncle of Christopher Yiman from Seattle.
Yes, I'm Uncle Ronald's nephew.
Yes, we have a multi-generational group here today. So, Don Ronaldo, you recently wrote a book about your family history. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you decided to write that book?
I wrote this book with the intention of introducing my family, my beloved grandfather, Layo Sui, who died at an early age, and wanted to introduce him to the entire family. And so it encompasses the life of Layo and his two wives, Nellie Ribeiro Albert and Annie Hawkins. It also comprises my own history with that of my parents situated in Trinidad. It's a discovery of a young man trying to find his roots and his own spiritual journey that began in Trinidad and has taken him across Europe to the United States and, of course, travels across China.
And why was it important for you to write that book, or how did you become interested in it?
it was important for me because it's my own spiritual journey, and my family coined me as the family historian. So they always wanted to find out who we are, where we are, and our family's history is intertwined with the arrival of the Spanish and Portuguese on Columbus's third voyage into the lands of the Taínos, the predominantly Arawak and Carib peoples of the Caribbean, and which, with their lives intertwining of Spanish and Taino and Africans and Chinese immigrants, emerge our Caribbean Creole identity. So I'm the results of European, African, the native peoples, and the last batch of Chinese immigrants of the early 20th century. In other words, my great-great-grandmothers and grandmother were Creole, and my grandfathers and great-grandfathers and biological father were Chinese from the north and south of China.
Yeah. And you both have a very rich family history. So you have some Chinese and Creole and Spanish, and your family grew up in Trinidad. And I'm wondering, Chris, I know you grew up in Trinidad. Did you hear about a lot of this family history prior to Don Ronaldo writing the book? Or was that something that you found out later in life?
Not really. No, I feel like a lot of Trinidadians have a history that sounds like what we just described, where there's a lot of different races and different countries that make up their ethnic and cultural origins. But I feel like it's stuff that is not always passed down, and we don't really have a culture of that in Trinidad. Like, because so much of that phase of mixing and immigration took place in like colonial and post-colonial times, it's not really, we don't really have that history like written down, and we don't have a lot of people that know about it. So I feel like Uncle Ronald's generation is like one of the last that knows. Like, even amongst his brothers, he's like the only one that knows who everybody is and whose numbers is who and like what the origins are. So I feel like growing up for me, I just knew I was a Chinese. You know, that's how we call it in Trinidad. As a Trinidadian, and I was a Chinese, and the exact details, still not that clear, if I'm honest. And it's one of those things that I kind of always tell myself I have to come back and like spend some time with Uncle Ronald and like write this stuff down for myself. I know he has it written down somewhere, but also write it down for my own self. So yeah, it's one of those things that's still kind of a journey.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I know in Don Ronaldo's book, he talks about his family maintained some Chinese traditions, a lot of, kind of mixed and Trinidadian traditions, but they still tried to incorporate some things, even using a little bit of like Chinese words and things like that too. It sounds like your family, it had kind of been lost, but by the time it got to your generation.
Yeah, this is very commonplace with a lot of the Chinese families in Trinidad from around that time. I feel like Uncle Ronald and his brothers have Chinese names, but nobody speaks Chinese. Nobody speaks Cantonese or Mandarin. And the most that I can think of when it comes to that past is my grandfather did teach me a couple of words, but none of them really stuck. Like, nobody else in the family really um, knows any Cantonese or Mandarin. And like, I think Ronald knows who our great grandfather is and some of that history, but like, he went back to China, so we don't really know. There could be like a whole other branch of the family that we don't know about as we forged our own stuff here in the West. So yeah.
Yeah, we grew up very Creole Annie rather than predominantly Chinese. And with my mother and her sisters, our identity was always mixed. I think Creole for Americans would be like the Creoles of Louisiana. When I went to Louisiana to work, I felt very much at home with the Creoles of the area that I lived in. And mainly because I can speak French and I could understand part of their patois, I felt they would call me their island cousin. But I said the only difference between them and me was my grandfathers were Chinese. So this is how I describe myself, as a Creole Chinese. I think Christopher describes himself as a Blasian, Black and Asian. I prefer the terminology Creole Chinese because of my grandmother, and they were what we call payols, Spanish people who lived on the cocoa plantations. And I do remember visiting the area where we call San Rafael, where my grandmother's people were. So I have a greater affinity to Creole and also Chinese too. My biological father came from Shanghai. So only in the later years of my life, I decided to explore my Chinese heritage. But it is a nice combination of both Chinese and Afro-European heritages.
So, like, that's how we perceive our heritage. But growing up in Trinidad, we're Chinese. Like, Trinidadians look at us and see a Chinese person.
Yeah, that's how they determine us. I had to fight for my Creole identity because I kept telling them my mother is not Chinese. My mother is literally half white. So even my mother's sisters, they look like Uyghurs or Métis of North Dakota, or like Kazakh from Kyrgyzstan, but they all identify themselves as Chinese. And when you look at them, Annie, you will think, but these are half-white people. They're like the Métis of Belcourt, North Dakota. And you will think, how are they Chinese? But this is how even my aunt in Boston, when I asked her how she identified herself, she always said to me, I'm Chinese.
Yeah. And I think it's just because of how I feel like a lot of people, not just in Trinidad, like how they will classify you according to a race is based on like how their brain is trained to see a person's face and like recognize the race in there.
Yeah, and how they look like.
Yeah.
When Christopher walked with me, everybody sees Christopher, I think, as a Black person. I don't know how do they look upon you, Americans look upon you, Christopher?
Yeah, no, that is in Trinidad they would see a Chinese person, but in America they see a Black person. So, like growing up in Trinidad, like if you have like a little drop of Chinese blood in you, you're Chinese because you look different than someone who is Douglas or Black or of Indian of South Asian descent. Because they're so good at recognizing the Chinese in someone's face when they see them walking around. Especially for me, when I was a kid, I looked really Asian. I didn't look Black at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, and they would use, I mean, sometimes the racist terms as, here comes the Black Chinese. And even a lot of half of our family is literally Afro-Trinidadian, but the other half is also European. We have relatives that look very much like the Uyghurs of China, Annie, or like Kazakhs. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I introduced my brother to the Kazakhs, they all said, Ronald, they look like us. And I said, yes. Trinidadians do not see any differences. They don't recognize our grandmothers. And when I was growing up, everybody would ask me, who is that lady? I said, that is my aunt, and those are my mother's sisters. And they presumed that they were either Spanish or half white, but they would never consider them Chinese. But I've always been very proud of both identities. My travels abroad have broadened my vision much more than if I was still living in Trinidad.
Right. Chris, I kind of wanted to talk to you because you had mentioned in our previous conversation that you grew up looking more Chinese and that people in Trinidad identified you as Chinese. But then when you came to the US, you said it was different. Can you talk about that transition and what was different for you?
I would say like fitting in with the theme of the podcast, that's like my big narrative is uh being a Chinese person who was suddenly told that you're actually not Chinese at all. At least the way that you're being perceived. So I came to the US. I came to a school upstate New York, and I lived in New York for about 9 years. And foreign student life is hard. You're broke all the time, and it's like difficult to find support and a clique and a group of friends in such a big city. So like that identity search is always kind of like at the forefront. So like I go into it being like, oh, I'm Asian, I'm a Chinese person, and then as time goes on, you start to realize that Americans really don't see that. They just see like a black person. And it was kind of frustrating. I certainly let myself get frustrated about it in maybe like the first 3 to 5 years of living in America. It was always something where I was like, why don't people see it?
Yeah. There is something called colorism in American society, Annie. Colorism is a major problem among Black people. You always have people who are lighter skin or darker shades. And so that is an issue that most African Americans do not like to talk about.
Right. Like people with lighter skin tend to have higher status, kind of. I think, like you said, Chris, I think people are kind of trained to look for certain facial features to recognize race. So in the US, the features that we look for in a black person or an Asian person are probably different than what Trinidadians see because people are a lot more mixed there.
Yeah. And it was pretty much across the board. Like, Trinidad is a place that has a lot of mixed race people. So, like, I have other half black, half Chinese friends too. And, like, we all share this experience where people look at us and see a Latino. So I would be on the subway and, like, a Mexican person would walk up to me and start talking Spanish. And I'd be like, oh, sorry. I mean, Asian people, I remember I would be at the job in New York and I would be talking to Asian people at the job and be like, no, I'm Chinese too. And they're like, really? You don't you see it? Like, and then I would do the thing where I would like cover like my face so you just saw the eyes. Like, what? Look right there. It's like right there. Like, they're like, I don't know. Do you look Thai? Maybe are you Thai? Like, okay, well,
Yeah.
sure. I feel like the only people who could see that there was something were other black people, and it would be kind of funny. I'd be sitting on the train, um, on the subway in New York, and a black person would be sitting there like, staring at me, and like kind of sheepishly, they'd like ask me like they would ask me like, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm like being inappropriate or rude or whatever, but are you mixed with something? And then I'd be like, yeah, no, I'm mixed with Chinese. Da, 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 da. And you could just imagine they were sitting there on the train, like staring at me, like, okay, this person is black, but they're not blacks. Something else is going on in there, and they just couldn't help themselves.
As I get older, I look like an old Chinaman. But when I was younger, I look very Latin because of my hair and so on, and because of our color. I am lighter skinned than Christopher, and so there is a kind of racial bias towards people of mixed identities.
Yeah, definitely. And I think kind of like you both talked about, there's a lot of kind of like policing within the communities. Like even Asians, they have an idea of what an Asian looks like. And so when someone doesn't have the same features, then they're like, oh, then you aren't Asian. But that's not true because Asians can look like however, and they can be mixed with whomever. And same thing with people in the Black community and people in the Creole community and anything else. So, and I think, Chris, you had said something interesting too, and some of the stuff you'd written to me, where race, you said to you, race seems like something that's put on you. It's not purely an identity that you choose for yourself.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many stories like that where I had this definition of what my race was, and then I had to retrain what that definition was once I came to the US.
I was surprised when I heard Christopher and my nephews and my niece describe themselves as Blasians. I understand where they were coming from, but I felt a little saddened because the Creole aspect of our culture is kind of lost in the wider African American society. And the Creole is a mixture of all these different races. I really love to remember the Caribbean peoples who were decimated. I mean, they were replaced by Africans, Indians, Chinese, Europeans. And so I love to mention that when I worked among Native peoples in North Dakota and Louisiana, they always address me as their distant cousin. I still, if I go to Belcourt or any of the Indian reservations, they accept me as one of them. They look upon me as, oh, here comes one of our cousins from the islands. So I have a different experience because I'm lighter skinned. And even when I began working in North Dakota, I remember going to the office in one of the doctor's office, and I looked at the chart, and she reassigned me as white because I was the only non-white person in this entire area. And I was kind of startled by that. I said to her, I'm not exactly white, only because I lived in North Dakota, and there is such a scarcity of other races, Annie. I'm sure you have experienced that in your own life.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you're comparing someplace like Trinidad, like we talked about, where most people probably have some sort of mixed ancestry, whereas in North Dakota, I mean, there are people who do, but I think a large majority of people have European ancestry and just identify as white. So yeah, I think that was probably very different. I'm sure the move to Fargo was very different for you too, Don Ronaldo.
Oh, definitely. But there is something also to with language. Because I speak French and Spanish, I'm easily accepted into a whole different groups of people. When I'm in different groups that speak different languages, particularly Spanish or French, they consider me one of them. When I worked in Dulac in Louisiana, and because I spoke French, the Huma people from the Bayou Indians accepted me as one of them. If when I was working in the Belcourt area among the Métis are the mixed Indian and French trappers, they just accepted me as one of them because I almost looked like one of them. If I didn't have a Trinidadian or Caribbean accent, they would think I was from Belcourt. Sometimes I have that problem. I may be walking on the street in Fargo, and somebody might think that I'm a drunk Native American, which I really don't like at all. I had to stop one day, and I told this person, "I'm sorry, but I'm not drunk, and I'm very proud of my native roots." And what you just said to me, young man, was racist, especially with when they had all of these Asian conflicts and still do. And,
Right.
and you know that prejudice, Annie, in North Dakota. And I was really annoyed. But I was also frightened for my own safety because this person nearly ran me down with his car. He thought I was drunk. And so there's also a lack of respect for the native peoples, of which I empathize because my grandmother was of Arawak Carib ancestry.
Right. There are a lot of stereotypes too about and negative associations with Native people in North Dakota and across the country. One thing I want to touch on a little bit, is the topic of interracial relationships. So maybe Don Ronaldo, you could start. I know in your book you talked about for a time that you dated a Black woman and that your mom, despite being Creole and of part African ancestry, really disapproved of the relationship. Are you comfortable talking a bit about that?
Well, that was 50 years ago. We have a saying in Trinidad. You need, from my generation, Ronnie, as my mother would say, you need to put some more milk in the coffee. In other words, you have to lighten the pigmentation of our race. And I think people don't like to talk about such things, but I think it still exists. We all favor the child who is lighter skinned. I see that even in my own family. I see that among my cousins who have married Danish or Finnish or German people, and their children are lighter skin and look more European. I see that in my friends who have married Afro-Americans who are lighter skin, and their children become, they look differently. So what is it like? I think the racism still exists, unfortunately, and intermarriage between non-white peoples, especially for Chinese, is still a taboo topic. I was so shocked about 50 years ago when I brought home to my mother's home this Afro-Trinidadian woman, and my mother said, "In no way can you marry this woman." And I said to my mother, "But half of our family is black." And my mother's response was, "She is just too black, Ronald." So my mother was very blunt, but I think in our Trinidad, in our Caribbean society, we still have these thoughts. We don't voice it again as we used to, but the prejudices, unfortunately, still exist. What do you think, Christopher?
I mean, I have like a whole journey around that myself. Coming back to that experience of coming over here to the US and being considered a black person, I used to push back against it in my mind for like a while. I'd be like, no, I'm not black. I'm mixed. I'm black, but also Chinese. And it would be like a source of contention for a while for me until I sort of came to the realization that like that sentiment like is a form of anti-blackness that resides in my heart. And maybe it's one of those things that like comes down from the generations, like what Ronald is talking about, like some form of that I have internalized um through that kind of those kinds of just being in that space and being around that sentiment. So I had to kind of unlearn that feeling and just accept like, it's actually perfectly fine that Americans see me as a black person. There's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to be Malaysian. It's okay to be a Creole Chinese. All these definitions are true, and like fighting against it is just gonna make you unpleasant and unhappy. So, as far as the relationship goes, I sort of like go into it knowing that story for that I have of myself and kind of wondering if other Asians think the same way. And I mean, I have other stories where where I've realized, oh yeah, actually this is a thing. I was once dating a girl who was she was of Chinese, she's Chinese, and she was pretty keen on me, and she wanted to have me meet her parents, and she was all ready to do it, and they were in town, and something happened, and she sat me down and was like, "Well, we can't have I can't have you meet them right now because I told them that you're part black, and they're like not so happy about it." And I was like, "Whoa." I was, it's one of those things where, like, Trinidad, we pride ourselves on being very accepting of other races, and it was one of those things I couldn't even get offended because it seemed so inconceivable to me. I was like, "What? That's absurd. That's ridiculous." And then, but the part that did actually upset me is where she was trying to like rationalize their thoughts, or rationalize their thinking to me, like explain like maybe she's trying to like take both sides and like see, well, they think that if we had a kid he would have a harder time. I'm like, what? It just seemed like the type of thing where like I couldn't even get mad in the moment because it just seemed kind of ridiculous. But as time has gone on, that's when I started to realize that, oh, the anti-blackness, Asians have it lives on in Asian hearts as well, and
it continues, unfortunately, and unfortunately, a lot of Asian people prefer Europeans rather than African Americans. It's a whole question of a lack of history and ignorance. Just picture the difference, Annie. If Christopher had invited me to his former girlfriend's house, and they would say, "But how come? How come he is? How come this is your uncle?" I have a situation with one of my nephews who is saying to me, "They accept you, Uncle Ron, but they don't accept me, and I'm the prospective bridegroom." So
yeah. So I mean, like, what always gets me about that story is not that her parents acted that way, because old generation thinking, etc., etc., is that somehow that thinking jumped a generation, and she thought that was like an okay thing to think, you know.
Wow.
So for me, after that was honestly like the most um overt racism that I ever experienced since I came to the U.S. And it was not from a white person; it was from an Asian person, and it was from a Chinese person, and I'm Chinese, so I was. It was the type of thing where it just kind of blew my mind for like a while, and I spent a lot of time processing that and understanding that anti-blackness is not just a white person thing. It lives in everyone's heart. Colorism lives in everyone's hearts. And, you read about it and you see it in other cultures that are not colonial cultures that have colorism,
I noticed that too, Annie. You had asked me in China, the same thing appears. You look in all Chinese advertisements, and they always prefer the Chinese who look more European. I think that's why the Uyghurs and the Kyrgyzstan are so more acceptable on Chinese posters. They never use they even criticize one of their top models whose eyes were too small. You have a lot of Asian people who do a lot of cosmetic surgery in order to look more European.
Right. There's like eyelid surgery and whitening creams and things like that.
I told one of my youngest brothers, I said, if he were younger, he would be ideal for Chinese modeling society. Because he looks half white, he looks perfectly for their advertisement. This clear skin, these European eyes, face, and facial features. So unfortunately, colorism at different levels exists in every single ethnicity that I have experienced and places where I've lived, whether it is in Latin America, whether it's in the Caribbean, or whether it is in Europe. I mean, even among Europeans, you have different degrees of what is more acceptable. I mean, among Europeans, they look down upon Eastern Europeans. I was so surprised how some Northern Europeans look down upon Southern Europeans. And they're the same race.
Right. It's like people always find something to divide themselves by, whether it's race or religion or who knows, ancestry, all those
Yeah,
things.
so yeah, I mean, like all of these experiences, I feel have been like a fast track in under like I feel like if you were born in the US and raised in the US, you just sort of have learned to assimilate these ideas in your head, the good ones and the bad ones over time, so it
Yeah.
feels relatively
Wow.
normal. And I feel like for folks like us, like Uncle Ronald and I, who moved here as adults, it's kind of like being put on the fast track school to learn all these things and learn how it really works out here. And I feel like, well, for me, um, my thing is that one, my frustration is no longer about whether or not I'm black or Asian. I'm perfectly happy being a black person, and it's something that I feel like it took some time to come to terms with. But my frustration is also kind of like with what Ronald is talking about, like that sentiment that people have behind closed doors. I feel like anti-blackness in the Asian community is a thing that Asians don't really talk about, like ever, pretty much. And like it shows up in relationships, like walking around Seattle, I see Asian women dating white guys way more than I ever see them dating anybody else. And sometimes, like bringing all this baggage that I have, I see it in the street and I wonder, something going on here? Because this is a little weird. But it's also something where it's like, because it may or may not be a bias, you can't you can't then have a confirmation bias based on your own experiences and come to jump to conclusions without data.
Right.
So it's the type of thing where like it sort of sits in the back of my mind and I wonder, is there a race angle to this?
Yeah.
And like living in the US, I start to realize that that's kind of how everything works, especially for a person of color and for BIPOCs. You have to go and you have to engage with a lot of aspects of society with that sitting in the back of your head, like there might be a race angle to this, whatever it is, schooling, the job, healthcare, real estate, dating. Like it's one of those things that was like the biggest culture shock when you come here from a place like Trinidad, which we talk like we don't have a lot of racialism and racial divides, and we think that we live it in a lot of ways. And for them, you ask any Trini, and they will look at a Trini, a black Trini, a white Trini, a Chinese Trini, and say, "That's my brother." In a lot of ways, we live that. So that part felt kind of sad, to be honest. It's like having a certain naiveness like shed from you when you come here. And it makes me think back to like how Caribbean societies work and small island societies like that, where it kind of makes me go back to it and think like, is there also a race angle here, like in America or other places? Like, I don't think so, but um, that's kind of where I'm at right now when it comes to this kind of thing. Is trying to understand, um, like it. I don't think it's fair to other countries to place how race works in the U.S. on those other places, but it is also helpful to understand that it is very possible.
Chris, I'd be curious to hear. So I know Don Ronaldo, he was able to travel back to a lot of the places where your ancestors are from. So he traveled all around Europe and he visited China. I'm wondering if you have any interest, now that you know a little bit more about your family history, in visiting some of those places and learning more about the families that you've descended from.
I do totally. I feel like that's kind of central to like the Caribbean mythology. Is that in order to cope with our place in the world, you kind of have to treat the island as the new home, right? You're not necessarily Mother Africa or Mother India or Mother China. It's Mother Trinidad and Tobago. And
Yeah.
I think in spite of that, we tell ourselves that, but filling in those gaps from before that feels good. And I think I don't think all Trinidadians think that way, but I think like enough of them certainly do. For my part in it, I am learning Mandarin, and I would like to engage with Uncle Ronald and find out what he knows and start that search. I know that Trini historians have a fair amount of background knowledge on that stuff. In some ways, like what is lost is kind of forever lost because I feel like learning it as an adult, it's not internalized in the same way, you know? But for me as a baseline, I just would like to find out like which part of China are we from? What was
Okay.
what was our original name? And like what kind of Chinese are we? You know, in a lot of the Chinese in the Caribbean are Hakka Chinese, not necessarily Han Chinese, but
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the case with our family or how many families in Trinidad.
We have
case for.
both Cantonese and Han Chinese and also Manchu Chinese. So we are both North and South. I was thinking of what Christopher had just mentioned. There's no Mother Africa or Mother Europe. In one of my poems about my own mother, which I had written before she died in the year 1999, I said in this poem, and can I quote it?
Go for it.
My mother, a reminder of different days. Veins in her, no Mother Africa, no Mother Europe, no Mother India, no Mother China. The echoes of a long forgotten memory, one mother. For she who swims to ease her pains sees only her children. I literally love my family of such diversity. When I grew up among my mother and her sisters, there were 20 of us, and all of us look differently. We look like a group of Brazilian children, Hispanic children, and we all had such, we were dark, we were light skinned, straight hair, kinky hair, whatever. But we were always treated by our mothers as their children. For she who swims to ease her pains, my mother, sees only her children. They never saw color. I never grew up with that feeling that I was different from any of my cousins who were darker or lighter skinned than me.
Yeah, same with my generation. A lot of that stuff is learned behavior from living in the US, I feel like.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is true. When I first arrived in New York City when I was 17 years old, I realized, oh my gosh, I am not exactly Chinese because I don't speak Cantonese and I don't speak Mandarin. And here I am, a Chinese-looking Hispanic who speaks Spanish and French. So I was always the oddball. I was always the sandwich between races and cultures. And it happened to me when 17 years later, when I went to Europe, I felt more comfortable among Southern Italians rather than the Korean priests that I met, who were incredibly wonderful. But I felt much more at home with either the Brazilians or the Argentinians or those from my part of the world. And it's also a combination of culture too and background. I grew up as a, how would Americans say, as a Hispanic person. And I love my Hispanic culture. I mean, our family's name is Ribeiro and Alberto. And so I just have a Chinese name for my father, and it's Iman.
Yeah.
So good measure. It is a wonderful identity. I didn't expect to talk about race, Annie, this afternoon with you.
Yeah, wonderful. I think Chris is going to say something quick.
Yeah, I was gonna say like this is very commonplace in in Commonwealth post-colonial countries like this, like all Trinidadians, all Jamaicans, Guyanese people, we have a story like this, because we are descended from slaves. So like you get it from both sides, right? Like we don't really know what the Chinese history is, but we don't know what the African history is either. And I think like because there are a lot more people of African descent in the Caribbean, a lot more people have put the work in to try to bridge that gap and figure it out. Like central to coping with that prospect, you kind of have to create new routes in the new island. And I mean, even with what Ronald is saying, my surname is not really a Chinese name. Like when you ask a Chinese person, "Have you ever heard the surname Yimon before?" They'll be like, "Are you sure? I don't think so."
Yeah,
And
it's a name created by the English immigrant officer.
mm-hmm.
And so we even have false names. So it's kind of our identities are lost. So we are the new creation for a whole new century. I think if you want to see what the modern day person looks like, come to Trinidad.
I want to talk a little bit about religion, which is certainly a big topic in your book. And as a retired priest, I know that religion is very important to you. So your mother and your grandmother were also very religious. And I'm wondering if sharing in their Catholic faith helps you feel more connected to them, and if you tie it very closely with your Trinidadian culture.
Oh, definitely. Because of them, I became a Catholic priest. And they were very devout Catholic women, and created in me a devoted Catholic man who became the example that they all yearn for, and to become a priest. And I have been a priest for the last 37 years. I have been in religious life for the last 47 years. So I have devoted most of my life to this Christian faith. But I also have an experience of my father's religion or belief in Buddhism and in Confucian ideology and philosophy. What I've learned from all of these religions and experience come from the wisdom of the great Siddhartha Buddha. Three things that really matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gratefully you let go of things not meant for you. I think is basic upon all religions, and they exemplify in three persons. In 2018, my beloved nephew and family, Christopher, and all of us, we lost 8 of our relatives in 2018. What I learned from the 3 most significant deaths: Christopher's mother's Joy, my brother Ming, and my beloved friend Daniel, were joy, kindness, and justice. They are perfect examples of kindness. And this is at the very core for me of all religion and of our Christian faith. How to be a kind person. Kindness in your eyes, as Mother Teresa would say, kindness in your greeting, kindness in the way how you approach others, kindness in everything that you say and do. This is, to me, the essence of all religious belief: kindness.
Absolutely. And Chris, I'd like to hear your perspective. If you're comfortable, you can talk about if you're religious or not, but I'd kind of specifically be interested in if you tie Catholicism with a part of your identity as a Trinidadian person.
I suppose I was raised Catholic up to a point. But and I feel, well, for me, like on my mom's side, she was open to a lot of different Christian identities. So I'm not as closely tied to Catholicism as Ronald is. And so I mean, I was raised Jehovah's Witness at some point, and we were Seventh-day Adventists for a while. Um, there's a lot of religion in Trinidad, and a lot of Christian religion, and so Christianity is something I've always been raised with. Currently, I'm agnostic, and it's kind of tied to what Ronald was referring to there, where we had some deaths in the family. For me, I just have a broader viewpoint on such things. I feel like I'm still trying to figure out where my spirituality lies. And currently, I'm at that place where I just think that you should dedicate your life to making the world better in some capacity, and that the other details are not something I want to spend as much time focusing on. So, you know, social causes, I think, is kind of how I try to express my spirituality. Yeah, for me, it's more about like putting things into action so that you make it better for your fellow man. So
Yeah, doing good.
yeah.
I mean, our family was always based on taking care of those less fortunate. We have terrific examples, and I our family is also very diverse too, religiously, and not only Catholic. Three of my brothers joined other Christian beliefs. Even my own cousins, two of my cousins became Hindus. My beloved brother who died, Ming, embraced Buddhist ideas. But he also, as I said to Christopher, the essence of all religions is kindness. And if you want to see the example of kindness and love and joy, you just have to remember your mother, Joy. She carried her name Joy, joyfully. And she was a terrific woman, especially in service of those less fortunate. She was a great science teacher. My brother Ming, who was very much actively involved in the environment, he was very keen on getting rid of plastics in the sea. And my friend Daniel, who was very centered upon justice issues, social injustices, racial injustice. So to me, if my nephew finds his way through kindness, through joy, and through justice, to me, he has found God. In whatever way you want to conceive him or her.
Yeah.
I applaud him for his kindness, and he's a terrific example of his mother's joyful spirit. Come sadness, she was always joyful. Come joy, and she was always joyful. She's a terrific example of what it is to be a good Christian. And my brother Ming was a terrific example of what it was to be a Buddhist. Mm-hmm. And my beloved friend Daniel was a perfect example of what it is to be a good Catholic. It all came down to one simple word, Annie. How to be kind in a world of so much hatred and injustice and bigotry and all that divides us rather than that brings us together.
Right. That's beautiful. I just have one more question, and it's going to be the same question that I'll ask each of you. But what is the most important advice that you've learned from your elders that you hope to pass down to the next generation in your family? So maybe Don Ronaldo, you can go first.
Oh, for the next generation, I think it's be kind, be just, be joyful. And they are exemplified in three persons that I love and miss tremendously. Kindness, through my brother Ming. Joyfulness, through my sister-in-law Joy, that's Christopher's mother. And justice, through my beloved friend Daniel. So for the next generation, exemplified in three persons in my life, and in the words that I articulate, again, be kind, be just, be joyful.
For me, What I have learned is that all you have in this life is the impact that you had on other people and how you treated other people. So, like, money doesn't really matter in the sense that you should not be pursuing it for the sake of it. You should be pursuing it in the service of being able to impact other people's lives more positively.
Wow.
And what
I
the
love
type
that.
of things that you should be doing in this life should be in service, of that, because you're going to leave all that stuff behind. You're going to leave all the money behind. But
Mm.
the impact that you had on other people is the only remnants of your time on this earth. When I was
Wow.
with when my mom was in hospice in Trinidad, she was the only one that had family members come to visit her. You know, pretty much everyone else that was in the hospice was just like sitting there by themselves every day. No one ever came to see them. I think like one school group who was doing it as a volunteering activity would come and talk to some of the folks in the hospice, but nobody, like, her room was always full up all the time. We were there, her kids were there, husband was there, and she's a teacher. She impacted a lot of people's lives positively,
Yeah.
and some of those
Hundreds
people
of
came
people.
to visit her. So her room was always full, and that's really what this life is about. At the end of the day, if you're just pursuing
May
money
I
for
add,
this,
may I add something to Christopher's wise words,
Yes,
Annie?
go for it.
From Maya Angelou, that great Afro-American poet. She said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think my beloved nephew Christopher has found it. His mother made people happy. His uncle who died made people feel so welcome. And my friend Daniel made people feel so loved. If I were to die tomorrow, I would love people to remember Ronald made me feel good about myself. I hope that if I were to die tomorrow, Christopher would say, oh, my Uncle Ronnie was always made me feel good about myself. I would want him to remember as he remembered his mother. She was loved, she was welcome, she was a good woman. This is the essence of our religious beliefs. It doesn't matter to me right now whether he is Catholic or Buddhist or Hindu or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, you better stay with us for a while, Uncle Ronald. If you go, we are screwed. Okay, you are basically the backbone of the Yvonne family, so you give us a minute, okay? Don't go anywhere.
Yeah, as the poet says, I have many more miles to go.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a great nephew in New York City. He is Annie, as white as you could possibly imagine, and he comes from all our races together. When I am anxious to hold this child in my arms and sing to him our French patois songs, I'm anxious to sing to him. We have such a beautiful culture, Annie. We have so many beautiful songs, and I'm hopeful that when Christopher has his children, I keep teasing him and saying, you have to name these three children Ming, Joy, and Daniel, exemplified in joyfulness, in kindness, and justice. And this was really fantastic. I thank you for the pleasure of talking with you and with my nephew, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing your stories and giving us all some really great advice. Thank you for listening to Misfits. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Please follow us on Twitter at ACXPMisfits and on Instagram at ACXPMisfits, where you can also send us a message with ideas for the show or let us know if you or anyone you know would like to come on as a guest. We'd love to have you. Also, thank you to Gabe Fordunker for the music in today's show.